but to thank you to Paul Jansen, who is the Chief Operating Officer in Bjortzog Britain and Ireland, so one of Brendan Martin's colleagues. Paul is Dutch, and Paul has a great wide and varied experience with the Bjortzog model within Europe as well. And today's WebEx is entitled Repurposing what our organisation has to do to repurpose, which it's titled is the biggest challenge. So what do teams need from the organisations themselves? Everything from IT support, what kind of leadership styles, the mindset, all down to practical changes. So thank you very much for joining us, Paul. Over to you.
Pleasure. Thank you very much. Yes, as Alec has correctly said, I am indeed Dutch, but I've lived in the UK now for 22 years, so I've got extensive experience with working in the public sector here in the UK. And what we try to share with you today is some of our experiences with helping organizations in their ambition to adopt the Bjortzog model in their own context. Of course, there are lots of elements of the Bjortzog model that we are convinced that work seamlessly also in the UK, but there are always contextual issues that we need to take into consideration, and we'll touch upon some of those today. And we also touch upon the different starting point that most of you will have by coming to the Bjortzog model from the context of an existing organization, which is very different from starting from a position that Bjortzog had, which was that they were able to start as a small startup without having to transform an existing structure, culture, or organizational mindset. Alec, if you could put on the next slide, please. Before I go into the details, and I can talk about organizational repurposing all day long, so what I will try to do is, in the 20 or so minutes that I have, try to take some big steps, but give you the key findings from our experience, and then there will be time, of course, for you to ask any questions, and we'll try and answer as many as I can. But before I delve into the organizational implications for introducing the Bjortzog model in your setting, it's important to realize, I think, what the starting point has been. And I'm sure most of you will have seen some of these images before. You have perhaps already attended some of the other webinars. But it's important to understand that the starting point for Bjortzog, or reminding ourselves, I guess, that the starting point for the self-management aspect of Bjortzog is really their care model. Let's remind ourselves that Bjortzog, first and foremost, is about wholly being patient-centered and allowing the care professionals to dedicate the flexibility of their or having a flexibility and holistic approach to how that care is going to be attuned to the needs of the client. And that means, as I'm sure you are aware, that Bjortzog care professionals invest a considerable amount of time in establishing a relationship with the client, understanding who this client is, understanding what is important to her, understanding sort of what we call the informal network, so understanding who the other players are around this particular individual, so that the care approach can be established that helps this person in the most efficient and effective way to get back on their feet and become self-reliant again, and taking ownership and leaving the direction of the care with the client ultimately. Now, if you are that care professional, and if you are therefore using that flexibility in attuning your care to this particular client, that means that you need flexibility in how you organize yourself. That means that you need the flexibility not to be time and task oriented, but totally patient oriented, and therefore make constantly decisions that you're not going to be challenged on. You need to have that ownership, and you need to have that empowerment. And that's when it becomes a logical next step to have these teams of professionals becoming self-managed. Because in order to be that much attuned to the needs of your patient and your patient's informal network, you need to be able to make those decisions yourself, and with your colleagues, and they can't be planned for or delegated to by higher levels in the organization. So once you understand that, therefore, that the self-management aspect of the model flows logically from the care model and the vision that Buurtzorg has around the best approach to care for an individual, then I think you begin to understand why self-management has become such a logical extension of that. And then the next question, therefore, becomes how can you allow these teams of self-managing care professionals to do this in the best possible way? And this is, I think, where the organizational repurposing comes into play. So, Alex, perhaps if you can move on to the next slide. As I said in my introduction, what we are facing in the UK is not so much organizations that want to start from scratch with something akin to Buurtzorg. No, we are dealing with existing organizations with existing hierarchies, existing infrastructures, existing cultures, and often organizations that have a lot more services to deliver than just, between inverted commas, community care or district nursing. And that means that when we are trying to introduce and adopt this Buurtzorg model, that this will always be in the context of a larger organization that perhaps will remain untouched, certainly in the first instance. Of course, you can imagine that our ambition is to transform the entire organization, but but let's take baby steps on this. This is significant change, and we want to make sure that we don't lose anyone along the process. So that means that what you're really trying to aim for is some sort of hybrid organization, and that's a challenge in its own right. So how do we do that? Alec, if you could move on to the next slide, please. We try to create what we have called a green field within a brown field. It's a term from the world of building and house building, I guess. But a green field is really a totally new area where new laws apply, where the normal rules and regulations really are suspended for a while. And that means that we try to create within the existing organizations almost a protected bubble where we can apply these new ways of working, where not everything that the organization has always done will automatically apply. If anything, we try to press the reset button quite significantly and suspend all assumptions and almost start from scratch. And we try to then implement in that green field all those key elements that by now hopefully you're beginning to become quite familiar with, that make up the Buurtzorg model. So that means that we introduced that care model with the full focus on the client and its informal network. We introduced one or several teams in small defined locations where they can establish local connections more easily and understand who the movers and shakers are and where are the resources that can be used for the care of the client, but also where communication lines with other healthcare professionals and other professionals and institutions in the system can be kept short and personal, so that that communication can be of high quality and quick. Other elements, of course, in the model are the introduction of the coach, who has predominantly got this focus on the team and making sure that the team is well functioning, and this the role of the heat shield, who has predominantly the focus of dealing with the rest of the organization, and I'll come back to that in a moment. We will also introduce and repurpose the way back office performs its function in supporting the organization and making sure that it runs like clockwork. And we do that through something that we call a support center, and again, I'll tell you more about it in a minute. We introduced a framework, and I understand that the previous webinar was dedicated to this, so hopefully by now you're familiar with that. Again, I will explain how that fits in with the total setup. And this is all done with under the main objective to keep things small and simple. That mantra that Buurtzorg has and has been able to implement and execute to perfection in its own context. Alec, if you could move on to the next slide, please. So, if you recall that earlier picture, now let's zoom in a little bit on how we create that protected bubble. Essentially, we're trying to shield off this new world, these sets of new teams with their coach, by creating something that we call a heat shield. This is actually a person. This is a person who is fully empowered by senior executive management and has totally the brief to try and implement the Buurtzorg model as fully as possible. And therefore, it needs to have a very clear mandate that this is the role that the heat shield performs. The key role of the heat shield is to really try and keep the rest of the organization from doing what it normally does. Because, like I said, the normal rules in this bubble do not apply, and therefore it's important that someone is that linchpin between existing world and new world, and that's exactly what the role of the heat shield is all about. So this is a person usually, and this is a person essentially with a transformational role in once the entire organization has been transformed into the way of working of Buurtzorg. This role may no longer be required, but from very early on in these implementations, they're absolutely essential. And this needs to be obviously a person who knows the organization well, has got a lot of connections and credibility in the organization, but also understands the concept of the Buurtzorg model extremely well. And the heat shield works very much as a guardian of the framework. Remember that the framework was essentially the agreement between the wider organization and the teams, making clear what the teams will deliver, setting boundaries for the teams so that their self-management is not boundless, and they will know what they're down for, so to speak, and the organization can be trustful that those teams will deliver what the organization ultimately needs from them. And the heat shield will basically work with that framework in mind, and will make sure that both the organization and the teams will stick to that as much as possible. Now, the heat shield doesn't do this alone. The heat shield is working hand in glove with the support center. And the support center is essentially going to be the blueprint for the future back office. So perhaps we can move on to the next slide, Alec, and we can talk about that some more. So the heat shield and support center, they essentially have four functions. First and foremost, it's a firewall. That's very much as I described as the heat shield role to be. That is keeping essentially those elements that do no longer apply in the Buurtzorg bubble at bay. And the heat shield is predominantly performing that function, but the support center has that role to a certain extent and helps the heat shield with that. The second role is removing obstacles. So removing obstacles that allow or that make it hard for the teams to perform their self-managing role. And therefore that could mean that, and we have had pilots where with the help of the support center, rules were changed. For instance, the team in a particular location, the teams were not responsible for the care budget for their particular clients. That really hampered their functioning. It slowed down their decision making. The rest of the organization was certainly reducing the effectiveness of the teams. And with the help of the support center and the heat shield, this was changed so that the teams did get the care budgets of those individuals and became a lot more effective as a result. The third role of the support center and the heat shield is simplification. Making life easier, making life simpler for the team so that they can really focus on doing their jobs and delivering a great care that should be one of the aspirations in life of the people working in the support center. And this could be, I don't know, by organizing Oyster cards so that they can move around more freely through the big city, or by sorting out simple apps that allow them to put in their expenses much more quickly, or perhaps eliminate all of that. Lots and lots of simple things that actually can make a big difference to the front line. And you can imagine that therefore the ideal support center person is actually someone who loves this kind of problem solving and making life easier for their clients. They see the teams and the people in the teams as their clients, and they love making their lives easier. And fourthly, the role is really to provide support, and that means whatever is thrown at them, they will accept with a smile. They will go out and find solutions to them and represent essentially the teams in their quest for finding solutions and solving problems. And that could mean a simple problem as, oh, my iPad isn't working, can you get me a new one, to much more complicated matters around policies or how do we deal with particular cases or particular instances. So Alec, if we can move on to the next slide, please. That means that essentially the heat shield and the support center form a bit of a funnel, don't they? They are the single point of contact essentially for all the teams in all their support needs, and we'll try and resolve this as quickly and as efficiently and creatively as possible. But they're also the single point of contact for the existing back office functions in the standing organization, and they will solve their problems too. They will try to avoid having to go to the teams with those requests, but they will try and answer as much as possible those reporting needs, their information needs, their requests as much as possible. But we'll also sometimes say, well, sorry, but that particular request that you've just approached me with is no longer applicable for us and will not help the team. So let's not do that. And that, of course, is the biggest learning curve we often see in our pilots, is that sometimes existing policies, existing ways of working are being challenged, and as an organization, that is something that you need to get used to. But ultimately, through that process of challenging, you'll find that actually your lives can be made an awful lot simpler and more effective by doing so, and therefore becoming more efficient and therefore cheaper as well. So that's the concept in a nutshell, but all of this is not going to work unless there is a crucial role performed by the executive management, because you can imagine that a lot of parts of the existing organization, as I said, will have performed these roles in all good faith and for all the right reasons for many years. So to be confronted with this quite substantially different way of working will take some getting used to. And if you can move on to the next slide, Alec. It is therefore crucial that the executive management is fully on board with this process, and with understanding that when you adopt the Buurtzorg model in your organization, even if it's just a part, there's an absolutely crucial role for you as an executive to understand why you do this and what your long-term vision is, and that you communicate this very, very clearly and visibly to the rest of the organization. This is, like I said in my introduction, this is not just about self-managing. This is about changing slowly but steadily the entire organization. And you have to make that clear, not just by talking about it, but also by acting upon it. And that means that if you really want to if you want to have self-managing teams and organizations dealing with a process of simplification, you have to support that, and you'll have to be comfortable with that and showing that you're in your acting and your decision making, you're 100% behind that. And that means that when a certain bumps along the way occur, which they undoubtedly will, certainly in the pilot stage, as a senior executive, you will have to keep your eye on the long game and support your teams, your heat shields, your support center in their ambition to take ownership for that new way of working, and help your organization also to understand why that is, and that is happening with your green light and full support. Of course, for a senior exec, it also means that you already have to look beyond this particular phase in the process. So if you're in the middle of the pilot in itself is not the goal, is it? The pilot is one step on the way to a long-term vision. So for an executive to already think ahead, plan the next phase, understand that that perhaps in a pilot you may not find perfection, or you may not find the perfect evidence on all fronts in order for you to make a completely unambiguous decision. You may be prepared to, or you will have to be prepared perhaps to make sure that perfection doesn't become the enemy of the good enough. And therefore you should be willing to take decisions about moving on to the next phase and rolling it out more widely when you see that the right behaviors and the right effects are beginning to show. But it also means for an executive sometimes to sit on your hands and not do anything, and allow these teams to find their feet, find their confidence, and really see that they're empowered to make decisions, but sometimes also to make mistakes and learn from the mistakes and move on. And ultimately, therefore, for the executive is therefore a highly important role reserved in doing all of this, supporting this entire process of change, and understanding also that it's a learning process, probably for him or herself as well, and sometimes being not afraid to confess that perhaps they don't have the answers themselves either, and they are finding out themselves as part of the process how this works best. So if you can move on to the final slide then, and concluding a couple of things. So as I said before, this is not just about self-managing teams. This is about changing the behaviors, processes, and mindsets of the entire organization, where the support center and the heat shields perform a massively important role, but essentially sow the seeds for how back office functions at large should be performed in the longer run. So this process of simplification starts in that small bubble, but it shouldn't end there. Ideally, it should lead to a realization that actually perhaps we are over-managing people, and perhaps we are trying to stay in a position of controlling our professionals, but we could retreat to a position where, as an organization, we are still very much in control, but no longer telling our professionals how to do their jobs. And that, I think, is a very important realization as part of this process that you should be striving for. So in this process of repurposing, it really comes down to trusting the professional and creating the conditions for those teams to deliver the best possible care. That means that you have to start supporting your professionals and create this at your service culture. Think about how can I really support our frontline teams and allow them to do the best possible job. That means that you have to have the leadership behaviors that go with that, and you will have to have the ambition and, dare I say it, the courage to drive for simplification, less bureaucracy, in order to get better outcomes and a more enjoyable way of working for everyone involved. That was my presentation on repurposing the entire organization, and perhaps you understand the subtitle, how this can be quite a challenge for organizations. And perhaps I can answer some questions. Thank you very much, Paul, and thank you very much
for that really enlightening presentation. And in a moment, we will open the lines up, so you could ask Paul your questions over the phone. Also, I'd encourage you to put your questions in the chat box if you're not dialed in, or if you don't have audio. I've popped a couple of questions there in to get the ball rolling, wondering if this looks familiar out there for you, wondering if there's any local barriers that you're finding when you're trying to employ this methodology, this model of care in your area, and particularly around Paul's conversation and presentation around developing that back office support or support centre. The heat shield, who in your area is the heat shield, and is that a challenge? And the roles of the executive, is that something that's actually challenging, or do you find that that's actually something that's being well supported in your area too? And that's before we go to questions on the phone line or on the chat box. That's my question, Paul, to you, is that you mentioned, and I found it very interesting, the calling out of the importance of the executive role in all of this, and one of the part of the role was to remove obstacles, and wondering, since you've got this UK-wide view on other models, other NHS boards and health and social care partnerships that are doing similar things to the neighbourhood care programme, and indeed Europe, what would you say are the main obstacles that you find the execs are having to remove in order for neighbourhood care teams to form and to work?
I think the key obstacle really comes down to the infrastructure of policies and procedures that exist in the standing organisation. And what I see often is that executives, when push comes to shove, tend to try to adopt the Buurtzorg model while leaving that whole world of policies and procedures and behaviors and templates and reporting structures and all the rest of it, we are all familiar with it, intact. And that has at least two downsides. One is that self-managing teams will feel that they are still constricted, and they will feel very, very quickly that they can't have the full benefit of being self-managed and delivering care with this different mindset, because that system is not attuned to that. So they will feel straitjacketed in that environment. And if executives are not willing to push back that system, that existing system, and allow these teams to work in a real greenfield setting, then that's a problem. And secondly, it will ultimately not lead to the outcomes that they are looking for. So it will not lead to the maximum extent. At least it will probably lead to some improvements, but it will not lead to the maximum improvements that they can achieve, both in clinical and client-related outcomes and in financial outcomes. So they may actually not ultimately adopt it because they don't quite see the benefit as they hoped to receive it. You see that especially happening when a pilot reaches a bit of a bump in the road. Certain stuff happens, you know, it always does in projects. People may change jobs, someone might go and have a baby, then there is a new policy change or a change in government, or whatever the changes are. Stuff happens around projects, and that's exactly when executives need to hold steady and be the pilot on the plane that says, you know, yes, there is turbulence, but, you know, just fasten your seatbelts and we'll come through this, rather than, oh no, let's revert back to our standing way of working and our policies and procedures, and let's not challenge those. I think it's there where executives really can show their dedication to trying this out properly, and once they come through that, they will see that the benefits will really outweigh the investment significantly.
Thank you. Thank you very much for answering that. And then, so over to anybody else on the phone lines. Is there any questions? if, like me, you've forgotten to unmute your phone, please remember to, we told you at the start of the meeting to mute your phone, please. If you've got any questions, you press unmute. We've got Paul for another couple of minutes. Great opportunity to ask any questions.
Alec, it's Hilary here. Paul, thank you so much. That was very, very helpful this morning. I'm just wondering, we all work within very integrated teams, you know, with all sorts of disciplines, and very much within a matrix of care in the community with GPs and GP practices and that kind of thing. I'm just wondering how your teams, you know, how you can protect. I'm assuming that the Buurtzorg teams are nurses, so how do you manage to do that? But have them, how do they relate to the wider other disciplines within community settings?
Mm-hmm. It's a very good question. It's probably important, I think, well, if we look at the Buurtzorg teams in the Netherlands, let's start there for a second. They have taken a very strong view that teams are not consisting of multiple disciplines, and that means teams are made up of various levels of nurses and nurse assistants, as I'm sure you're aware. Yeah. And other healthcare professionals are being brought in as and when required, but around the client. So MDTs, there are sort of mini MDTs being created around the client when it's relevant for Mrs. So-and-so, who needs a particular group of professionals to get together and work together more closely to deliver the best possible care. I think that allows all the professionals to be deployed effectively and efficiently. I think that's certainly the finding of Buurtzorg in the Netherlands, that works better than having those disciplines all part of that team. If you then ask, okay, so how does that work with all the various systems that they deal with and the rules and regulations that they work on? Well, because they all come from their own different angle, it's less relevant for a Buurtzorg team to feel well, to be impacted by that. So the individual professionals, maybe the physio or the OT or the GP or the hospital, they will have their own policies and procedures and organizational guidelines, but they can deal with that, and it's not for the Buurtzorg team to necessarily have to interfere with or comply with. In the UK, that becomes slightly more of an exploration, I think, because of course in the NHS, everything is linked to everything, or at least that has been our ambition over the years. That's both system-wise and policy-wise. So it is quite a challenge to find a happy medium between removing some of the pressures of the bureaucratic system and where the IT processes also try to make us go, and at the same time making sure that those other functions can perform their functions properly and have the information at their disposal that they need. So there is no silver bullet there yet, I'm afraid. All of our pilots are trying to find their way through that, come up with different solutions that work for them. But I'm afraid I can't quite give you that blueprint that will work for everyone.
That's great. Thanks very much. Wishful thinking.
Yeah, sorry.
Yeah, but that's helpful. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you, Hilary. Gemma, if you could maybe check the chat box to see if there's any questions there, but is there any questions on the phone line? No more questions on the phone. Any questions from the chat box, Gemma?
No, nothing in the chat box, no.
Well, that's great. That does take us to time. So thank you very much, Paul. Thank you so much for giving your very unique and expert viewpoint. It's a privilege to have you on the line. If there is any questions that you've thought of afterwards from hearing this, as we said, we will be sharing the link to these recordings in our Knowledge Hub website. So if you have any questions afterwards, we can collate those and drop them to Paul afterwards. Our email address is there on the screen. It's hcis.livingwell@nhs.net. And just as a heads up as well, the final WebEx delivered by Buurtzorg Britain and Ireland will be on the 3rd of April, 2 to 2:30, webinar number 6. And that's the role of the team coach with a focus, delivered by Brendan Martin and Tanya Ebert, another colleague of yours, Paul, who's the OD consultant at Buurtzorg Britain and Ireland and also a Buurtzorg coach. So very much looking forward to the next and final in the series about generic attributes and the specifics of coaching self-managed teams, what needs to be learnt and unlearnt, the remit role and that intervision. So we're looking forward to that again on the 3rd of April, 2 to 2:30. So again, it just leaves me to thank you, Paul, again once more. Thank you very much for your time. It's much appreciated. And thank you everybody for your time too to join the WebEx. Please do get in touch if you want the link sent to you or any other information about the Neighbourhood Care Programme. But thanks for your participation, thanks for your questions, and we'll see